Good evening, and welcome to today's conversation in our series, Era of Reclamation. I'm Hartwig Fischer, Director of the British Museum. The Era of Reclamation series was introduced following conversations that began back in February 2019 between myself and Bonnie Greer, the former Deputy Chair of the British Museum's trustees and acclaimed playwright, novelist, critic, journalist, and broadcaster. Through these conversations, Bonnie and I endeavored to identify key aspects of current concerns and debates, and finally settled on the notion of reclamation, the need, the desire, and the right to claim, reclaim, proclaim, and acclaim identities, history, equality, freedom, and to define one's very own position as individual and as community in the midst of current developments. I invited Bonnie to curate a project that would explore this through a series of talks that focus on what Bonnie herself calls Meta-Africa, a world of experience, genius, and achievements that encompass both Africa and what has gone beyond Africa. So since January 2020, Era of Reclamation has explored topics such as women of African descent shaping global museums, diversity in society and big organizations, and the role of the Caribbean in Black history and world history. Continuing online for the time being, Era of Reclamation aims to open up the past in all its complexity, to face and define the present, and to help create another future. For today's discussion, Bonnie is joined by Christine Checinska, inaugural Curator of African and African Diaspora Fashion at the V&A, the Victoria and Albert Museum, Eunice Olumide, supermodel, actress, broadcaster, and curator, and British photographer Araminta de Clermont. Together, they will explore fashion as a means of expression, resistance, and power, and will look at how fashion has been used as a means of liberation and resilience. So without further ado, it gives me immense pleasure to welcome Bonnie and our esteemed guests. Bonnie, over to you.
Hartwig, thank you so much. And welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. I just want to, before I shut up, I just want to add to what Hartwig said. This project is very much a co-creation, and it's both of our discovery through the conversations that Hartwig invited me to discover that we both have a dedication to the Middle Passage and the experience of the Middle Passage and the experience of my ancestors and many of our ancestors on that Middle Passage and the kind of genius that was forged on that Middle Passage, and also the genius that was forged even under the duration and hardships of enslavement, something that Hartwig and I call shoreline thinking, that very, very astute possibility of transcendence, because our ancestors, if we were all descended from those who were enslaved, we are the children of people who decided to live. And also the genius of the continent itself, the genius of its own eminence and survival within itself under colonialization and exploitation. We want to make an investigation of this, come up with new ideas, new tropes, new shapes, new projects in which we can go into the 21st century, the mid-21st century, with new ideas wedded to the ones that exist already. So these conversations are talks with experts for the audience and for Hartwig and me to just get more information, get smarter, go deeper into this exploration. And we call this series of talks Icon Drum Talk, because everybody knows that drums talk. And the Icon Drum in the British Museum is very special to me because it is the oldest African-American artifact in existence. and it is here in London, and it's in a case, and it's for all of you to come see her. And it's free to come see her. We take donations, of course, but you know, it's free. And she is in a case, and she's there. And I see her when I go all the time, and she always talks to me. So through these talks with these three experts, these three beautiful women, and Hartwig at the end, I didn't mean it that way, but with Hartwig at the end, we'll see what the drum has to say. So the format's going to be this way: 5 minutes for each of the women to say whatever they like, and then we're just going to plunge into it. And toward the end, I like Hartwig to come back in because he's making this with me, and any kind of observations he has, any thoughts, and then we're going to open it out to you, whatever you want to say, whatever you feel, because this is a conversation in what the Greeks call the egina, the open space, free for everybody. So let's start. And Christine, do you want to start and introduce yourself and go for it?
Sure. Thank you so much, Bonnie. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Hartwig, as well. So as Hartwig has said, I am the Curator of African and African Diaspora Fashion at the V&A. It's a fairly new post, and it's a real honour to be part of that establishment. What I bring to that role is a background in industry, in the arts and in academia. So over 30 years of experience of designing. So I come at this whole discussion partly as a practitioner, but also as a historian. Much of my academic work looks at this issue of the relationship between fashion, culture and race, which I think between us all will start to unpack. And the fabulous Simon has put my first image up, which is really great. So I wanted to bring into the room the Afrocomb. So Bonnie, when you talk about Meta Africa and the Arkan drum, I tried to think, you know, what is my equivalent of the Arkan drum from the point of view of dress and self-fashioning? And for me, it has to be the Afrocomb. So I want to bring the Afrocomb to the table as my kind of opening gambit to talk about.
Use it every day, right?
Every day. Me not so much actually with my locks, but it's the thing that I think connects all of us in the African diaspora globally, and you'll find these wherever we've set up home. And the ones on the screen actually belong to a friend, and he used them to comb his little girl's hair when they were kids. But it's such a timeless design, and they're handmade. And I think about the hands that made them. And that takes me right back to this idea of the ship that you describe. The idea that we emerge from the ship with old world knowledge and a will to adorn. And I think for me, that's what the Afrocomb symbolizes. And in thinking about the Afrocomb and thinking about this idea of fashion as resistance and power, I did find myself thinking about what people in the streets were wearing over the summer. For example, the young people that left their homes and took themselves out and actually marched. And I feel when you look at these images, what they're actually wearing is dignity. They're wearing dignity, they're wearing pride in blackness. And I think for me, what this comes down to when we think about fashion in this context, it's about a reclamation of personhood. And that's what I think is at play. And if we start to look at some of these images and we look at the way that people are fashioning themselves, it connects back to the past. So for example, natural hairstyles that the three of us are sporting. I can see Eunice, you'll see in a moment with her wonderful afro, you, Bonnie, with your wonderful red hair, and this wonderful image on the screen. So the taking of traditional styles like cornrows, but recoloring them to make a statement about today. So adapting our natural hair forms. And then the next slide, please, Simon. One of the styles that's been really prevalent, certainly in part of London that I live, is the rediscovery of these styles. I mean, in the Caribbean, we used to call them chiny bumps. They're probably called other things elsewhere, but these little twists that women would wear, and often our mum would put our hair into this sort of style during the summer holiday. So it wasn't necessarily a style that you would wear out on the street, but the reclamation of something that is so traditional, revisiting it, and then it becomes a symbol of power. And I think it's kind of tied to the Black Power movement, for example, this idea of black is beautiful, the natural is beautiful. Can we have the next image, please, Simon? This really inspired me, the sort of sea of slogan t-shirts when you start to look back at documentary photographs. And for me, it's a reminder of the commemorative textiles that we, for example, at the V&A have in our archives. And I love this wonderful piece, which when we spoke earlier in the week, I mentioned it, freedom in my hand I bring. And I think that this whole idea of fashion, resistance and power, if we're wily about the way that we use fashion, if we're wily about trying to reflect something of our inner selves, it's almost as though those garments and those accessories are saying, freedom in my hand I bring. Can we have the next slide, please? And I loved looking back at some of the sort of DIY aesthetics of some of the things that people hastily daubed that I think are like commemorative textiles. They mark this moment, they'll canonize this moment. But I love the urgency of the text, the urgency of the message. And you can almost imagine someone taking a black umbrella and literally daubing the messages on. And within that, there is power and energy. And I love that. And then the next slide, please. So these things are coming out of traditions. And so then if you look at what people were wearing, this idea of almost a uniform of resistance. So you can see there, it's sportswear, it's do-rags, it's baseball caps, it's a camouflage suit. And then the next slide, this idea is not new. I love this image of the three men in their suits. Back in the day, the wearing of a suit on a street, either in London or in any city where we're not really meant to be, in inverted commas, was a uniform of resistance. So the suit was the armor with which men went out into battle to fight against society's stereotypes that might have said, well, you know, as Black people, we cannot be beautiful. As Black men, you cannot be elegant. You cannot represent yourself as gentlemen. And that's exactly what these men are doing here, resistance and power, but through everyday dress, through the suit. And then the next slide, please. And one of the things I'm coming to the end now. It's such a huge topic and a topic I'm passionate about.
It's beautiful.
I've been talk for half an hour, so I'm trying to rein myself in.
It's beautiful.
I'm going very quickly. So exactly, I wanted to draw on the work of 2 or 3 contemporary designers who I think do this thing of going back to the past, old world knowledge, if you like, and bring it to the fore in a new way for a contemporary fashion statement about pride in being Black, about dignity, about self-respect. And I absolutely loved this collection by Tolu Coker, who I was fortunate enough to speak with on email in the week. And I knew that she was referencing the Black Panther iconography, you know, the beret, the dark sunglasses, the leather, the fist, if you like, which we saw on banners and posters through the summer. But what I didn't know was that Tolu's, it's referencing her father. So there's personal history here as well as community history, and such a fabulously elegant collection that she created from that. And if you know how to read it, there are many, many levels on which you can read this. Really powerful work. The other designer that I want to mention, this is going to be my last slide, is Grace Wells Bonner, who I think is an absolute genius at mining many, many references to create, often from our cultural history, from Black cultural history, but to create something that's absolutely contemporary and powerful. And I think what I like about her work is that she almost resists definition because she draws on so many references. And I think she's definitely a kind of Renaissance woman, another powerful woman, which I love. Just the fact that, yes, it's fashion design, it's art practice, it's history mapping, history making. And to me, that's also about personhood, it's about resistance, it's about power. And it is all of these practices, whether it's the young person that took themselves into the street to march, or it's these fabulously creative designer women that I've drawn on at the end of my 5 minutes moment. I think that what all of these young people are saying, they're saying to society, I am human. And often we're saying this to a society that almost does its utmost to tell us that we're not. And they're doing this artfully, I think, through the medium of fashion. And that's really transcendent. And that's exciting. This idea of showing something of who we know we are on the inside, showing that on the outside through clothing. And I'm going to stop there.
Christine. It's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you very much. Araminta.
Thank you. That was wonderful. I'm Araminta, and I worked as a photographer in South Africa for 7 years. And I would like to present some young women who I think fit very well with this resistance, fashion and power. And following on from what Christine said, these young women, if we start with Namfla, they really are saying, this is who I really am, and taking ownership of themselves. So the series that I wanted to talk about is about the Matric Dance, which is the equivalent of the prom dance in America, except in the places where I shot in South Africa, which is townships, informal settlements, and partially formal settlements. It means so much. It's the night of these girls' lives, and up till now, and for many, it's seen as being the night of their lives forever, because there's very little hope in some of these places. But I think what is amazing about all these girls is they are shining with hope. But the community gets together to make sure that this is the perfect night, something that can never be taken away. So it's very special, the Matric Dance night, because a lot of the parents and families never had a chance to go to school and finish at this level. There's the first one in the family who'd actually managed to get through school, and that was incredible. It's very common to drop out in a lot of these places. They're very violent, sometimes a lot of poverty, so the child will have to leave as soon as possible school to go and get work, or gangsterism and just a lot of hardship. It's a very small percentage who get through. So I just sort of stumbled upon these women, and I'll never forget the first one I saw. I just got the most incredible goosebumps, because I was in this place and I was with this girl who looked beautiful, and she came out and the whole neighborhood ran from the shacks, like 300 people screaming and shouting, and the girl just shone, and she stood there in front of her community knowing that she was the most incredible girl pretty much every time. And yeah, it was incredible. The community is very important for the communities too, because they want to show their own children that this is what you can achieve, this can wait for you. So the whole community will get together and maybe donate some fabric or a bit of eyeliner or some money for, you know, shoes or whatever. It's not easy to get these outfits together, but they're incredibly prized. For some of the young women, they knew they were going to go and work in a fast food factory, kind of making crisps, you know, for example, one of them. And she knew that this was her night to be her fantasy self and to stand up for herself. So, yeah, the girls, the women, they all gave a lot of thought, like years of planning these dresses with cultural backgrounds and soap opera stars that they wanted to be like, and music videos. So they're not dressing for themselves only, they're also dressing for everybody else, but also really showing that they're not. I remember one of them said, it was my chance to show everybody I'm not a scruffy one, I'm a beautiful woman. So really quickly, just whizzing through them. This is Abigail. She chose to take her Louis Vuitton handbag to the dance, and she held it for the whole dance. And she comes from an area where if you put the name of the area on a job application, she doesn't believe that she's going to even get seen. So this was her chance to feel empowered and have a taste of the life that she sees in the magazines. And I think her face says it all. And then there's Lungi. So she based her outfit on a soap opera star, a very strong woman. in South Africa who stood up for herself, and I think you can see that in the way she holds herself. And what I love about lungi is she's got this fabric around her waist, like a cummerbund, and it's called shwe shwe fabric, and it's very traditional Eastern Cape fabric. But there's something, so it's a very stiff fabric until you wash it. And there's something about her being held by the Eastern Cape, where her family comes from, like round her core self, hugging her with all her dreams as well. I just love that picture. She was amazing. And then next we've got, I don't know who we've got next, I think Candice. So Candice dressed like a princess, like Cinderella in pink. It's not safe for girls there to dress up like a girl. She'd never worn a dress before, so she hired this dress, and then she insisted on getting hoops for it, and she held it up like a fairy tale princess because she could be a girl for that night. And she put glitter on, and it took her 8 hours to do her hair, and she was able to stand out and be feminine. And I love to show you as well Linda, because Linda had a teenage pregnancy, and it was hard enough anyway where she lived, getting through school and with her single mother. And then she managed to go through the pregnancy, study for her exams, and pass her exams with her tiny baby living in that shack behind her. And actually the brilliant thing about this photo is she's standing on the foundations of her new home.
I knew you were going to say that. This is great.
And she's wearing her Rihanna dress, and you know, she's looking beautiful and elegant and successful, and she's done it. And
can we do one more, and then there's so much that we want to talk about, and you've given us a lot of, you've certainly given me a lot of questions.
I think the last one should be Cordelia, because she's really embracing her roots. She's got the Xhosa face paint on her face, and she's got Haile Selassie on her stomach, and she's got the colors, and she designed it, and she's standing up for being, you know, African. And she's very inclusive. She's a very political young girl, and this is how she and Namfla both chose to go alone because their dresses said it all, which was very unusual.
Beautiful. It's beautiful.
Thank you,
Amanda. That's beautiful. Thank you. Eunice.
Good evening, everyone.
Yes.
Thank you so much for having me today. The previous speaker is amazing. I'm really blown away, and I'm thankful to be here today. So for me, the topic of today's symposia is so central to my journey within the fashion industry. I'm a fashion model, author, and broadcaster. And it was at an early age that I discovered that fashion is power. Fashion is not only power, but it is in fact political, particularly when it comes to Afro-Caribbean people. And I learned that around about the age of 15, and it really took me by surprise. I had been signed to a top model agency, and I had gone in full of hope and excitement, and I was told by my booker that I would have to relax my hair, and I'd have to make my hair essentially straight, or that I would have to start wearing a weave. And for me, I didn't quite understand why that was so important. Neither did I comprehend the significance of it, and that it was central to my success at that time within the industry. But I knew that I didn't want to do it. It wasn't for any particular reason. It's just something that I hadn't been exposed to before, coming from a small city of Edinburgh in Scotland. So I chose not to. And unfortunately, that led to me being dropped from that agency. So at that age, I learned that my appearance was loaded and was powerful and was seen as political. So I continued in my journey in fashion. It was my mother agency that had dropped me. I traveled around the world working for different brands, and in some situations I was told quite directly that my face just didn't fit. I was too dark, my hair was too curly. So I definitely learned quite early on that my appearance was not seen as beautiful by the prevailing European aesthetic that was set out for me to negotiate. I also learned as well, as demonstrated by this beautiful image, which is an oil piece by an artist called Oliver Nwanwu. And it's quite an interesting piece of art because of the dress that I'm wearing in the image. On the day that I wore this dress, I was shooting a documentary, and the documentary was on the brutal killing of Stephen Lawrence, which occurred here in the United Kingdom. And I deliberately chose this piece because I wanted to wear something that not only had a kind of European finish, but had a kind of intertextual feeling of Africanness or of vibrancy. I also wanted to wear something that was part of the circle economy. So this particular garment is reused and recycled, and I got it from a fashion boutique which loans out and rents out clothing for the day. And I thought it was really interesting that it had such resonance for so many people when I posted the image on social media. This incredible artist chose to do an oil painting. And when I asked him about it, he said there were two things about the image that he loved. He said he loved the dress, and he was captured by the powerful gaze. And those are two things that are, I suppose, we'll discuss more within the talk. But certainly clothing has always been used, I think, particularly within the Afro-Caribbean community, as a way to tell a story and to communicate and to voice the issues within our society, and indeed of rebellion. So we have the rebellion that Christine described. We also have the rappers in the 80s and 90s using fake fashion brands to kind of rebel against the organized fashion industry, which is so fascinating if you look at our journey. So for me, I learned quite early on that fashion is powerful and it has the capacity to move and change things. One last thing I'd love to say, particularly about hair, because I do believe that hair is part of beauty and it connects into fashion and style. And I think one of the most interesting things when we consider cultural appropriation, many people don't understand why that is important. Why is it important to recognize the history? Marcus Garvey said, people without the knowledge of their past history and culture, it's like a tree without roots. And a really quick example I have of that is I was on the high street and I went into a well-known store, and I went downstairs to what they call a braid bar, which have been popping up everywhere over the last year. And there I saw people doing something which we call cornrow in America and cane row here in the UK. And for me, I found this really fascinating because they had renamed it the boyfriend braid. Being from Nigeria, my parents are Nigerian, I am very aware that actually this is called the Khalis, and it's 1,000 and 1,000-year-old practice, which is not only spiritual but central to the culture and the identity of Yoruba people. And it was fascinating for me to see that that had been taken, and the history and the lineage and all of the things that went into such a significant cultural practice had been completely and utterly removed from it. And I felt that that was quite a dangerous thing, because when we don't understand what we're doing, it is very disrespectful to that legacy.
Eunice, I would love to come in now, if that's okay, because you're hitting on something, and I don't know where you're going to go. I don't want you to leave it. Do you see what I'm saying? So that's why I'm jumping in, because I don't want you to leave this. because this is exactly where I want to enter. And say two quick things. One thing that this era of reclamation that Hartwig and I are doing, it's a dig in the sense that what you do in museums is you go out and you dig in the ground and you see what's in there and you bring it up and you bring it up to the light, and then you try and figure out what it is. You put it in relation to the other objects that you have. Maybe you find out, oh my God, this takes all the things that we've learned, it throws it out the window because this thing is something else, or it becomes something else. So what you were saying about cultural appropriation, that is so fascinating to me. I want to plunge right into that. Two things. Yesterday was Thanksgiving, and so it was like Zoom time all over America. And I talked to a friend of mine who told me that her child is transitioning from being a boy to a girl, and she came on, and you know, I could think in the back of my brain, what was she choosing to look like? You know, what she grew up in totally in Black studies, Black culture. What was she choosing to look like? Because when I was growing up in the 60s, there were only two models of Black women, two examples. You either look like Diana Ross or Tina Turner, or you look like Angela Davis, okay, or Kathleen Cleaver, or that's what you look like. There wasn't anything in between that. It started to happen, got more and more, but there wasn't anything in between it. And so those of us who chose to look like Angela Davis decided to diss the people who look like Diana Ross, because we felt that straight hair was cultural appropriation. You know, what are you doing with straight hair? And this is the question. It goes back to the thing that Hartwig and I are exploring about a kind of genius. What are people of African descent actually doing when we take things from other cultures, when we use other kinds of things, when we take a ball dress and stand in a township, we take a couture? What are we doing? What are we doing when we take pictures and we do these things? And this is what I kind of want to talk about in a way, because we can all sort of lay out the tropes and get them. But part of what reclamation is to reclaim what we're doing so that we can use it to go further. So what exactly are we doing with all of this? What's happening? Because in a sense, these are from other spaces and other places. I mean, I wasn't born with straight hair. What's it about? What is all of this?
Yeah, I think that is completely valid, and I think it's something I actually consider quite a lot, because I have a lot of friends from various different backgrounds, and I've often asked that question. And the reason I asked the question was I thought about it from simply the perspective of a woman, not necessarily even an African woman. And I thought to myself, but surely we should be promoting natural beauty, self-love, being who you are. And what was happening with the people I knew in the LGBT community was when they were showing themselves or coming into their womanhood, that tended to reflect in most cases actually the Eurocentric view of beauty. So the straight hair,
But why? But I guess I'm saying, you know, in a sense, if we, and this again is an investigation, it's not like an interrogation, because we're trying to learn things, and I think it's an example of a great kind of genius, a mélange, as the French say, a mixture. But we want to unravel it a bit. What is exactly happening? Because when I was growing up in the 60s, there were not a lot of choices. Now there's a myriad of choices. There's a myriad of choices in fashion, male and female, that you can be. And at the same time, claim this thing called Blackness, this thing called Blackness, we can actually claim. You can walk down the street with blonde hair down to your behind, and you can still claim it. whereas when I was growing up, you couldn't. So is this part of our, going back to the shoreline thinking idea, is this part of our survival technique? Is this how we survive? Is this how we change ourselves to survive? Or is it more than that?
Does anyone want to pick up?
Christine, what do you think? Because because you're curating, and part of curation, if you know that I understand about it, in a museum in particular, is, you know, it's not a fashion gallery. It's actually, the clothing carries history, and the clothing also carries your analysis of history. You are the boss. You are the chief of this. Your analysis of this, and part of me, and part of the conversations that we have been having, Hartwig and I, is about the genius that happened on the slave boat, about the genius that happened on the plantations, the genius that happened in the townships, where people began to do things and change them, mutated. Is that the process of the hair, the blondness, all of this, the ball gowns in the townships, the different kinds of things that we do in order to be called Black, or we are Black?
I kind of agree, and it's interesting that your word mutation, because I think that particularly speaking as a Caribbean person or someone with Caribbean heritage, I think that we do have a unique and creative relationship to clothes. And I think it comes from the fact that historically we were a people that was stripped, basically.
Absolutely.
And so we know the power of being dressed. We know the power of being undressed. And I think we have a real knowledge around clothing and cloth across the African continent. And I think these are the sorts of things that are brought to bear on the way that we dress. And certainly in some of the research that I did when I was doing my PhD, talking to elderly African Caribbean gentlemen, which is how they like to describe themselves. And some of them will look back on their childhoods, you know, and there was one lovely gentleman that shared with me his earliest memories of having a suit made. And I remember him kind of sort of going like this. I was a bit about this tall and I had a suit made, and it was all around knowing the importance of being dressed, because it was a way of speaking, as you say, Eunice. But what I find interesting about particularly Caribbean people is the way that we are able to have this genius creativity, I think, in the everyday. Absolutely. That
Absolutely.
We apply. And it's about drawing on that creative spark within. And I think we said this earlier in the week, it's drawing on immanence, that which is within, rather than the technologies outside or without ourselves, beyond ourselves.
You know, one of the things that attracted me, sorry, Christine, one of the things that attracted me to Britain, to London in the 80s, was the multicultural nature of Black Britain. America was not as multicultural in the 80s as Black Britain was and still is. It didn't have the whole kind of panoply of style, of wit. I mean, we mostly have Southern roots. Our parents are from the same place. It's very kind of, it's not anymore, but it was then. And I was attracted to that, very much so. But what we've all been talking about, all of you, the root, has been something, the title of the curation is Resistance. But there's also, you know, we defying things all the time. Is that basically what it's about? Because if you're talking about defiance all the time, then there's something we're defying. And that takes an enormous amount of energy. It takes a narrowing of focus to a certain extent. That seems to me has become more and more of that, where people are using clothing and hair. It doesn't seem like there's an enormous amount of joy in it. And of course, I felt it was joy when I looked at it in the 80s, but I don't feel it now. I feel statements, positions. This is what I have to, am I completely off base with that? Araminta, did you find when you were working with the people you were working with, was it they're using clothing as a statement.
Yeah, but it was more than a statement for them. It was, sometimes looking back at the photographs, I actually wonder, having met some of them later, if actually some of them had actually changed by having this night, having this moment. And I believe that a couple of them actually definitely did. It fed them with something that I can't really explain, but it was more than a statement for those girls. It was like a life force and a hope.
You know, you brought back a memory for me. We talked about it when we had our preliminary conversation that I'm still kind of shocked about, that I literally blocked it out of my brain. And it's 3 decades now, almost, when I went to Elmina and was on the castle and went up to see, you know, I told you the story. I went up to see, I went to see the slave dungeons, and I went to the ramparts to look over the sea and to look at the sea to see where maybe my ancestors had been set out from their home to go to a strange land, to the void. And I had neglected for almost 30 years what I saw on those stairs as I was going up there. And you reminded me of it. I still don't know why you did. But as I was going up the stairs, there was a Black fashion model posing on the stairs and being photographed. And I don't know what, my brain must have done something, because she was over the slave dungeons and she was posing. I've totally wiped it out of my brain. And remembered it again when we all started talking. And I wonder if it has to do, and Eunice is kind of an expert on this too, I wonder if it has to do with a lot of times we live through the gaze of the other, that we are being looked at all the time, that we have to live in a world where we're looked at all the time, and we have to either stick a finger up to that look, or we, in a kind of strange way, revel in it and make it into our own thing. But it's this constant being under surveillance, in a way, that this gaze that's looking at us all the time, where fashion becomes that we're talking out. If this makes sense, what I'm saying.
I think when we were talking, I was saying something about in my world, you know, there's 2 things you've identified. On the one hand, although my particular look is seen as political for some reason to the rest of the world, I had to accept and sacrifice certain opportunities. I had to just accept that certain brands wouldn't use me. At the same time, there's this dichotomy, because there are other models who do conform and are successful and will do that shoot, such as you described, in order to increase their success within the industry. So that's where this kind of intersectionality of fashion and economy, fashion and finance and consumerism and the world, and how that relates to what we do and the acts that we commit as individuals. But at the same time, I do feel that, you know, my look is actually quite freeing. So therefore is quite fun. So it's simultaneously a statement and possibly painful, but at the same time it's extremely freeing and liberating and revolutionary, because I'm not wearing makeup and because I am completely natural. So I don't need to do this and I don't need to do that, and I don't need to pay money and spend it on those products. So I do think that it may seem as if everything is a statement at this moment in time in history. At the same time, there is fun and revolution within it.
That's very interesting what you say at the end, and something you said the other day that I kept, that when we were all talking, you talked about performative activism, which I thought was an incredible analysis, and wonder if some of the things that we're doing now in terms of you know, maybe showing Black fashion, maybe curating it, maybe making pictures about it, is a response or an add or necessary to this idea of performative activism, where we're always on display in a kind of way. We always are. If you are outside of the continent, or maybe even in it, there's always a display, a visibility. There's never a moment of sort of invisibility. And so do we in fact make things that make statements about that, one or the other, not necessarily from ourselves, but from the situation that we find ourselves in?
Well, I'll just briefly comment on that point, and I'd love to hear from Christina and Araminta on it as well. For me, when I use the term performative activism, it's quite specific, and it's regarding, you know, those individuals and people who are Afro-Caribbean, who may not have led their career or their work with any consciousness or any feeling of responsibility to the community, which I feel is personal choice, and I don't feel is a bad thing or is a good thing. That's up to you. But what tends to happen is something like George Floyd will happen, and suddenly racism is a trend, and suddenly it's cool to be Black, and it's cool to stand up for Black people. And really the only real issue with that, which is extremely significant, is that the people that we're trying to help suffer. Because if you suddenly start using people in your campaigns, on your magazine covers, who previously had said nothing about these topics, what happens is it has an extremely negative effect on the population and the community, because often those people in those positions don't have anything constructive to say or guidance to help those people.
Christina, I mean, I'm sorry, Araminta, what are you thinking? What are you thinking? You look pensive.
Well, it's big stuff, isn't it?
As a photographer, I mean, your eye is what we see. We see your eye. What do you think? And you know, it's not like a question about you. And in other words, they're decisions that you make because you're a photographer, and we can't see anything that you don't want us to see. So I'm interested in sort of the idea of shaping and what you are presenting to us.
Well, I think I'm mostly interested in sort of group identity and the power of belonging, and actually standing up and being part of something bigger than yourself that you really believe in. So when you were talking, and also talking about the suits, Christine, I was thinking about, like, I did a series of young men in South Africa who, having gone through an initiation process, which is actually the most sort of tribal in a way, you know, it's culturally hugely significant. In fact, it's the only thing that those young men feel that they can really own that other people can't. It's a very difficult topic. But when they come out of their time in the bush and they've become men, they wear these suits that interestingly are quite modeled on 1930s, 1950s kind of white colonial boss man. So in a way, they're being modeled on a outdated sort of idea of what could be powerful, but they own it in such a way that actually for them, they say it very much reminds them to, and I know it sounds kind of odd, but to stand up straight. And because of the way that people react to them, because people know that they've gone through these weeks in the bush and they've gone through the meeting their ancestors and all sorts of incredible things, the outsiders react to them in an entirely different way, full of respect. And I'm just really interested in how wearing those, so for the Xhosa it's suits, but for the Sotho men it was blankets that are incredibly interesting in their own right. The blankets, because they actually came from Scotland. Exactly. Via they're Scottish in originally, and then they got sort of appropriated by King Moshoeshoe, and he took them over, and now they're the most culturally sort of significant thing to the Sotho, and it's just a fascinating kind of melting pot of ideas. But for me, it's the thing of putting it on and people treating you differently. At last, you know, those those young men are treated with respect and listened to, and they can be part of conversations, and it's amazing.
Before, Christine, I want to ask you before we go to Hartwig for anything he's thinking, and then let's open it up to the audience if they have anything to say, or questions or statements. You are the person on the panel who will be the definer, okay? And I mean, in the sense that you're the curator. You're making, you will be shaping our thinking and cultural thinkers' thinking. People who will be forming museums, who will be thinking about them. Hopefully, there'll be Black people, you know, like Lonnie Bunch in America, who will want to make a museum that is dedicated to African Caribbean culture. I mean, in a huge way, whatever. How do you encompass all of these different sort of strands? Because it is an ocean of activity. How do you encompass it in a collection that has to be in a formal space? It has to meet a certain standard to be, that maybe not be a standard that, it has to meet a certain level. How do you do all of this? How do you make all this work?
I think in some ways, I almost want to draw on the conversation that you sparked with Araminta and this idea of the eye. So I think that much of what I'll be doing will be obviously seen through my eyes and curated through my eye. But what I bring to this role is a leaning on this idea of conversation. So I accept and I know and I acknowledge the fact that expertise can take many forms in exactly the same way that activism can take many forms, actually. So experts might be people on the ground, the wearers of a garment, the young women in Araminta's photographs. Experts might be the makers of these pieces, the creative practitioners, and they also might be the researchers. So I'm keen to begin having conversations with all of these different experts, knowing that knowledge and expertise resides beyond the walls of museums. And for me, it's about, yes, using my eye to select, my eye to edit, but to have conversations that inform and shape that. But then once we start to acquire these pieces, it's about opening up the archives for many voices to interpret. So this idea of conversation feels very important in terms of the way I work, and then also in the way that the archives will function. And for me, my hope is that Black people especially will come to the V&A and know that it's theirs, it belongs to them, it belongs to everyone. You know, I'm the custodian, I'm the caretaker, if you like. Yes, I'm selecting, but I'm looking after these objects. The objects belong to everyone. And that's really what I want to achieve.
So you're basically talking about developing, and I don't know, you know, how it will be developed because this will be your shape, but a kind of co-curatorial sort of situation in which there's input at a very high level. And I know that part of what Hartwig and I talk about is co-curation and how important it is. How do you define it for now and going forward in terms of looking at not only museums, probably fashion houses as well. How do you co-make? How do you co-speak? And Hartwig, did you have any thoughts as you're sitting there and you're muted?
So mute.
Unmute. Oh, you're still muted. Is there something?
Now, is that better?
Yes, perfect.
Sorry. As you say, I was sitting here and I felt throughout extremely privileged to be able to listen to you, to all of you. And I thought this is an incredible conversation. Before I start to relate to some of the things you've said, I want to share something that the artist Lothar Baumgarten once told me, who in the late 70s lived for a year and a half with the Yanomami in the Upper Orinoco region, with them in their semi-nomadic way, with their round, houses where the different families had their fireplaces. So there was a round place in the middle, which was shared by everybody. And he told me that early on, as he joined the community, the men would laugh their head off watching him, walking across that center space. And they told him, look, guy, you don't even know how to walk. We're going to teach you how you walk when you are seen by everybody. When everybody looks at you, you have to, as the Italians say, you make a bella figura. It's a question of dignity, of beauty, of honor, of strength, and everything. And it was not because they were not wearing any clothes. It was really the fashion of the body and the way you would give shape. You would fashion your being in a way through the movements you would make. And that question of personhood that Christine mentioned at the beginning, the reclamation of personhood, dignity, resistance. And in a way, listening to you, I felt we were going from that kind of assertion of the self through the way you make yourself seen, and at the same time you react to the gaze of the other. And the gaze is the gaze of the members of your community, but obviously also the members of other communities. And it's as Eunice has very, I thought, poignantly said, fashion is power. It is political. It reacts to something, and it places yourself in that context of, if you like, contestation and self-assertion. Aware or not aware, as Christine has said, that the power of clothing is also informed by the experience of being stripped. So I think that listening to you, what I felt was that in this marvel of being beautiful and of making a gift of you being visible to the others, there is that age-old knowledge, both of that primordial dignity and that dignity being stripped of you, and you being
conflict between it. Yeah
exactly. So, and at the same time, as Araminta has said, looking at the young women having that moment of their fantasy self, I think there is the marvel, the miracle of beauty, which I think is extremely powerful, and which has to do with so many things that make us, shape us, that constitute us as fellow human beings. And I thought your conversation really gave us an incredibly wide horizon between those aspects of the self making herself or himself seen to others, being looked at by others, and those much tougher political, societal frictions and more or less explicit menace, aggression even, in the midst of which you define your own space. And I think you've shown us admirably the role of fashion in this extremely complex whole. So I thought this was really extraordinary where you took us.
And, you know, I want to add to that, to that. 400 years of history is not a long time, it's yesterday. And we hold within us, all of us, memory, because it's passed down to us. The memory of not being able to wear what we want to wear, of being able to be told our names, of being put into uniforms, or being in public places where your clothes are taken off of you, or whatever. And those are still in us. It's passed down through our ancestors, is in us. And so there's always the defiance of those things. And one last thing I want to say is, when I came to this country in '86, I was very lonely for a while, because one thing, I was not Afro, I'm not African Caribbean. So there's stuff I just didn't know. And people would look at me and start talking to me, and I couldn't respond because I didn't know what to say. I would go to the Brixton Market and get my food, and they all start laughing at me. And, you know, I was thinking, oh, you know, I was just shaken by the whole thing. And then one day I was in the tube, I was just going through the tube, and there was a big poster of Naomi Campbell. I will never forget it. And I think it was at the end of the '80s. And I looked at this Black girl, and I had never seen anybody like her before. She wasn't glamorous or anything. They shot her like, to me, she looked like who she was. And I know it was a fashion shoot, and I know she was advertising a product, and I know all of that. But what it did for me at that moment was make me feel I could live in this country, to see her, because I had never seen anything like that before. And that's what it is too, is we are at the same time, and this reclamation curation is an investigation. So Harvig and I are saying these things in an investigative, questioning way. We somehow survive and thrive in these junctures that are not that long ago. And we find our personhood in them, even as we're being commercialized still. And we try as hard as we can to grab some of the commercialization, but we'll never have the whole thing, because that's not the way it is. So that's a kind of genius too, that we find a way to stay up on our feet. We find a way to express ourselves, our artistry, our being, in the midst of still this commercialization, still this mercantilism, still this division, still this abuse in many ways. We still find a way to have this genius that I think is what we mean when we say shoreline thinking. You come off that boat and you figure, right, I'm going to make it here. I'm going to survive this. I'm going to survive this. I'm going to find a strategy, and I'm going to survive this. And not only am I going to survive, as Talley Theater's got a piece that's going now called Black Joy. We're going to have some joy in it too, some Black joy in it. Is there, we can do questions now. Shut up. We can do questions now. Yes. Michael asks, and this is for everyone, when does cross-cultural engagement and appreciation become, and this is brilliant, so I'm gonna say it really slowly because it's brilliant. When does cross-cultural engagement and appreciation become appropriation? Also, how does it differ? Eunice, you wanna go first?
It's an excellent question, very multifaceted and very complex. The first thing that popped into my head when you asked the question was being from Scotland and being surrounded by people who are extremely proud of their history and culture. When I think about the objects of culture, such as, say, the bagpipes or Scottish Highland dancing, I think that you can do all of these things, and you can do Scottish dancing, and you can play the bagpipes. But if someone was to come to you and say, oh, that's the bagpipes, if you were to respond and say, this isn't the bagpipes, this is, and use a different name, then that's when you're veering into this area of accidental appropriation, unknowing or unconscious appropriation. And that's when it can be dangerous, because you don't actually understand the history of the clothing or the culture that you are using. And at that point, as opposed to being defensive, one should say, ask the question, why? Why is this this? How is this this? And what do you know that I don't know?
Thank you, Eunice. Christine, you got a response to that.
I think for me, appropriation is where there's as Eunice has said, there's a lack of knowledge about the history or the roots of an object or a thing. There's also a lack of respect, I think. It's where people take an idea, they don't bother to do the research, they don't bother to acknowledge, but they kind of take it and kind of misuse it. So I think there's an element of lack of respect that for me characterizes that switch, that flip into appropriation.
How do you know when that happens, Christine? How do you know when that lack of respect happens? How does it happen? How do you know when it happens?
I mean, I think it's interesting, because part of me wants, every bone in my body wants to say, I can feel it, but that's not.
I was going to say that too, right?
That's not a good answer. But I think it is, as Eunice is saying, if with a little prodding, someone's clearly not done any research and is clearly not interested in looking at the history or looking at the naming of something. That's when you know. It's with that little prod, do a little bit of digging, and then you can usually find out.
Araminta, this question was from Michael Burgess from Africa Fashion Week, London. And what's your take on this question? On
appropriation? I don't know, I'm quite a magpie. I quite like a lot of different stuff. The only thing I can think is about motive, because we know what our motives are. We know if we're virtue signaling or if we're actually understanding and sort of living a certain joy in something. So I think joy and motive, and being open to learning and listening and being open.
How big do museums? Do they do that? Is that what a museum does, in a sense?
It does. It invites you to do it. I think, in the word appropriation is property. And this is why, on the one hand, you make it your own, ownership. On the other hand, I always feel slightly nervous in the face of whatever object it is, if it's a bagpipe or, whatever you might look at, take into your hand or put into your collection. Because it's not, I wonder if it's really about appropriation, or if it's not much rather about activating those things. And it can be many things, and many, very, very many different things, and they can come from very different times and very different regions, and activate them as your own cultural resource. I think that's what the museum invites you to do. That's what your conversation invites us to do. It offers us something that we can, internalize and make it into something that shapes us, that we use to shape something. And I'd say, Christine, that you're right. It requires, first of all, it requires some passion, some love, something hits you. It's, suddenly it becomes meaningful to you. And you better try to study it a little bit to understand it. But I think there is also a lot of merit in misunderstanding things. Mm-hmm. So in a way, you take something, you make it your own, you misunderstand it, and you transform it into something else.
And you get a little beat up in the process of being of misunderstanding, which is good too.
Well, there is also transformation. A great jazz musician who plays one of the songs of the American Songbook, and does with it what she or he wants, is wonderful, because there's the freedom of transformation, and even of playing around with the banality perhaps of the melody. And there's deep respect at the same time. And I think that those are moments we always look for.
And I think respect is the key. And this is Mehmet's question. Actually, you walked right into it, which is really good. Mehmet wants to know, are there also connections with reclamation of sexuality as well as African cultural heritage to consider? Let me read this again. Mehmet wants to know if there are also connections with reclamation of sexuality as well as African cultural heritage to consider. I'm interested to know what he means by sexuality, because as I said, my question at the beginning, the point I made at the beginning about my friend's child who is transitioning into being a woman, which is what she is. What do we mean by sexuality? I mean, what exactly do we mean? Because his question is connections with reclamation of sexuality. Whose sexuality, first of all? And actually the question seems to me to be asking, does fashion fashion is a construct, it's a thing that exists in a moment of time. It's not a thing in nature, it's something that's fashioned. And when it comes toward the Black body, does it become an expression of the maker's reaction to the body, to the face? If they aren't that, let's say, I'm going to interpret it that way. Eunice, you have been, like, as they say in America, down the barrel with this. I mean, do you see some merit in this question?
I think, again, it's an excellent question. I think it throws up these ideas of what is sexuality, what is gender. Because you're a woman, must you wear a dress? Because you're a man, must you wear trousers? When we think about fashion, I think...
Eunice, wait a minute, Eunice. Maybe I'm asking you something deeper than that in a way, excuse me. I'm asking, what's being done to you? Model. And I think that's what that is, because, you can be walking down the street as a person. You're walking down the street and then somebody spots you, because that's all the time it happens. You're spotted. What's happening? And are you aware of what's happening? I think that's partly what this question is, because you're being fashioned in fashion. And then Araminta, come in on that as well. Eunice, yes. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
100%. That's exactly what's happening, is you're being fashioned, and it's this kind of thing of the voyeur, like the gaze, as we touched upon earlier. And I think in my industry, the way that you appear is completely out of your control. Whereas what's interesting about your friend's situation is that they're in a position where they're going to choose that for themselves, and they're going to choose that from a plethora of places and ideas. And I think the second part of the question, very briefly, is also fascinating, because we can see in pre-colonial Nigeria, for example, that women were extremely empowered. They were in charge of everything from industry to business. They were trading in the markets. And someone like Margaret Ekpo comes to mind.
And they were warriors as well. They were warriors as well.
So, but then in post-colonial Nigeria, what we see is women being stripped of their power, stripped of their ability, being pushed into the kind of European way that women should behave and how they should be seen within society.
Amanda, do you want to weigh in on that? Do you have any thoughts? Because you take pictures, and your eye catches something. Something happens for you, and it's a process that's in you. Is it an expression of you, or is it what you, or are you making something that is exterior? Can you tell us that briefly, as we've got one more question, and then we can go.
I'm so bad with that mute button. What I get really drawn to is actually somebody who doesn't have a voice, doesn't have materials, hasn't been taught to use their voice, and will just pick up whatever scraps they can or cobble together whatever, and just has this extraordinary voice. But it's about, for me, that question brought up the idea of safety, you know, the gender and the race and the ability to feel safe enough. And that's what came out for me with the Matric girls. That was the night where they were surrounded by enough people to be safe enough to be powerful and women in those places. And I think, yeah, safety is the big one.
Can you know what? I know we run over. I know this, but let me just do two more, and if we have to go, we got to go. This is the question. I love this. Somebody said decolonialization didn't come up in it today, and why didn't we talk about it? Well, that's what we are talking about, isn't it? I thought it was what we're talking about is decolonialization, and we're talking about it without using the word, because the minute you use the word decolonialization, everybody goes to their corner, and they go there, and they talk from there, and we have to be talking about decolonialization. We couldn't have this conversation if it wasn't about decolonialization, and whatever that means, and part of the genius I always think about when I think of soul music and the blues, and I think of James Brown, is how people take stuff that's been used to oppress them and make it into their own art. And they've decolonialized it in some way, even though on the outside it doesn't look like it. Jazz is all about taking stuff and changing it up into something else. And that's decolonialization. The minute the pieces that Christine showed us, the minute those brothers walk, you know, you can see those brothers back in the day come off of name just went out of my head, the street where all the Taylor streets, the beautiful Savile Row. You can see these brothers come off of Savile Row in a Savile Row suit. The very act of them having the suit on is decolonialization. They've done that. They've done it in their person, in themselves. So that's what I would say in quick answer to that. And then there's one to me about, have I investigated the different expressions of fashion in different parts of the world, such as the Caribbean, that is rooted in our ancestors? I intend to. That's a big one. I intend to. Christine's gonna help me. And the last question is, I like this one, she's doing her dissertation on Afro-sartorialism and decoloniality, the politics of dress in the late colonial era. She wants to ask, how do we identify normalcy or normalcy? How do we identify normalcy in the acts of resistance? Can I twist that question around and for our last question to ask, how do we identify resistance in acts of normalcy? How do we do that? How do you find them? How do we know when they are there? How do we celebrate them? How do we point them out? How do we show them? How big? How are you going to show them?
I was looking to you for the answer.
Right, okay, we do that together. But anyway, we got to do that one. Christine, what will you do with the collection? Because you have an extraordinary opportunity, and it is unique, and you know that. I'm not saying that to you. I'm saying that to the audience, that this is something that does not exist anywhere in the world. So how are you doing that? How are you going to make that happen? Make us see.
I think through providing a platform for creativity and providing a platform from which we can show the diversity, the richness, the eclectic nature, for example, of the African fashion scene. But for me, at its root, it's about showcasing creativity And I think part of this discussion for me has been around the idea of the creative spirit within and how that cannot be taken away. It's the one thing that cannot be suppressed. And I think it will always bubble up. So for me, it's about trying to almost corral that sense of abundant creativity and allow it to bubble up within our museum.
Can I say one last thing before we sign off? I don't know if he's in the audience. I get this message to him, please, for me. But Mr. Andre Leon Talley, for me, is kind of a god. And let me explain why that's true. He took the so-called haute couture, which is the height of the heights, and he made it even higher than haute. He made it into an expression of Blackness, of solidarity, and of extreme beauty. He also did what all great jazz musicians do. When they see something that's being played, they decide to do something else. And that's what he did. And that's what we do, I think, yes, in this industry. And I also want to just give homage to Naomi Campbell and Eunice, to you, to all of the people who bring this to us and make us and help us see and to dream further. And I'm thanking all of you who came to listen to us. I'm thanking the women on this panel who I just will continue this conversation forever. And this, I think, Habig, you may agree, that this is helping us to shape this era of reclamation curation. And it was certainly the icon drum talking tonight through this. And thank you all. Thank you, British Museum. Thank you, Christina Tubb and Simon Malone and everyone who's made this possible. We will be back, I don't think next month, we will be back in January. And this is only part one of this conversation, by the way, ladies and gentlemen. As you can imagine, this ain't over. So we're gonna come back with the same crew and we're gonna do this again in about a month or two. Yeah. I think we can sign off now, Harvig, I think. And thank you all very, very much for joining us in this era of reclamation, icon drum talk, fashion as resistance, and shoreline thinking. Christine, Araminta, Eunice, I'm seeing you again, so I'm not gonna say goodbye. And I see you again, Harvig, all the time. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Bonnie.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.